Down, yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thanks very much. Great. So our next speaker here is Shtyrov from Medical Research Council in Cambridge. Do you have your telephone?
Yeah. Just close this down. Yeah, could I ask somebody to turn off the lights? Let me start with thanks. I think I must thank the organizers, not including myself, but the people at St. Petersburg University, and especially Professor Tatiana Chernigevskaya and Angelika Dubasova, who made this whole thing possible. I was just sort of sitting there in England, corresponding with them and Skyping quite a lot. But without them and without the support of this faculty of Liberal Arts and Sciences, this would not be possible. The faculty is providing us with a room, with facilities, with coffee breaks, with drinks later tonight. Please stay for the drinks at the postal, just after the postal session. So with that, I think I could begin my talk, which is about cortical plasticity underlying rapid word learning. So how do we learn new words? The very size of human lexicon that sort of counts into tens of thousands of words makes our system for communication unique and different from other communication systems used in the animal kingdom. And to achieve these sizes, people learn words quickly, especially as children. They acquire sometimes tens of words every day after just very few presentations. We know that new words in natural conditions are acquired through exposure. You just listen and repeat, which often happens in conjunction with objects or actions that these words define. And we also know from some studies, at least, that learning can be extremely rapid. After just a single presentation, allegedly, so-called fast mapping, you may have a representation for another word. And we also know that word forms, especially for children, are learned first, before there is any meaning attached to them. So you just learn the sound and the pronunciation before a child can fine-tune to the meaning of this or that word. The question I'd like to ask, though, is not generally about learning, but about how our brain does this sort of job. Certainly, learning of language should be rooted in a more general mechanism that is present in all animals, not just humans. And we know from at least one study that mechanisms of rapid learning, like fast mapping of words, can be found in dogs. At the same time, we know from basic neurophysiology of memory and learning, not including language, that neurons are very plastic. There are plastic changes occurring within minutes and hours in the neuronal structure, especially at the micro level of dendritic spines, axons, and cytoarchitectonics. Now, how exactly these plastic changes at neuronal level contribute to cognitive functions, we do not know exactly, but it is generally accepted that this plasticity is the basis of learning and memory. So, more about learning and memory at this stage. So traditionally, learning processes are broken for now a couple of decades, at least, into two stages. First, there is an initial encoding, which happens quickly and rapidly, and is dependent, according to many studies, on the hippocampus. And then there is a second stage of consolidation, which is slow and takes days, weeks, and some people claim months of sort of covert processing, which finally leads to formation of cortical memory spaces. So this is the stage that requires neocortex as well. And in terms of time, we know that at least it requires an overnight sleep. So this led to a suggestion of so-called complementary learning system approach, first put up by McLaren in 1995. There's sort of two systems that are complementary to each other, the fast encoding and the slow consolidation, that lead to formation of cortical memory traces, or otherwise seen as transfer of memories from hippocampus to the cortex. This fits lesion studies when animals hippocampi are lesioned, for example. This also fits patterns of retrograde amnesia known from the first work by Scoville in the 50s, who happened to remove a hippocampus in patient. Also fits computational models and has been adapted recently to language by Gaskell, Dumais and Davis. So most research to date has concentrated on this approach and on long-term effects of learning. So correlates of learning over days of practice, or at least an overnight learning. And there is good solid basis for these consolidation processes that go on. These involve, from the brain scientist perspective, changes in temporal cortices, in the hippocampus, also in localization, including hemispheric laterality of responses, in the extent and location of them. Now, there is only a minority of studies. If you remember what I said in the beginning, there are behavioral studies suggesting that that learning can be rapid. There is only a minority of studies looking at that effect. And the reason for that is because it's pretty difficult to do this. In traditional brain imaging approaches, you normally require multiple trials, which you record for hours or at least some tens of minutes, and then average all together to get decent signal-to-noise ratio, which is why this hasn't been done as much as sort of conventional approach to you learn today and we test you next week. But some studies have been done, and this is an example which doesn't show nicely, but I'll try anyway. So in this study by Breitenstein using fMRI, they let the subjects discover, the subjects were taught inside a fMRI scanner meaning of new words in association with pictures, and rather than just averaging everything together, they blocked the learning session into sub-blocks, and they found, interestingly, changes happening throughout the course of learning. And you'll see here the black line is the behavioral responses, so the hits, the subjects recognize new words better and better. And along with that, you can see that there is an increase in activity in inferior parietal cortical areas, the red line, and at the same time, a drop in activity in inferior parietal lobule. So this was perceptual. So at least few cortical areas were contributing to this. Not just, they also found hippocampal activation, of course. That's always found in learning and memory tasks. The study by Rochaker et al. Used covert articulation, and then therefore you find more motor activation as well. And here, almost everywhere, especially on the left hemispheric side, in superior temporal cortices and in operculum, you find a drop in activity as the subjects are better and better at producing new words. Now, of course, there were a few studies of this sort. fMRI is what I showed. There were a few studies using PET as well, showing both increase and decrease in different parts and a number of areas, particularly, of course, left lateralized cortices in addition to subcortical and hippocampal structures. So one message to take from these studies is there is a significant role for neocortical structures in this initial learning phase. It's not just hippocampal encoding. We all know, of course, that fMRI is terribly slow and language is terribly fast. So I'm getting my favorite point that fMRI is not good enough. Language dynamics is too quick for that. And method like EEG and MEG would be fast enough to track activity millisecond by millisecond, even though it may not be spatially as precise. So this is an example of a different study by Mr. Trasmusset and colleagues, where they let the subjects discover the meaning of new words from presentation. So they presented pseudo words, but always in context. So they were saying, Mario always forgets where he leaves the land key. The land key is the pseudo word, but then after another, you don't know what it is, but then after a couple more presentations you realize it must be a vehicle because its wheel was punctured or it was expensive to repair it. And interestingly, the pattern of N400, which is normally bigger for unknown words, changes with first and significantly to the third exposure already. It becomes the same as for real words. So we have these N400. There were a couple more studies showing a very similar effect. Borowski, 2010, was one other such study. But as we've heard today already, the first signs of lexical and semantic processes are noted for 100 milliseconds. That's what Daria told us in the beginning, and then Natalia was telling us more about this and others. We know from our studies that certainly at about 100 milliseconds we already have signs of lexical processes. So in that sense, 100 is secondary to that. And more importantly, in this context, it depends on the context. So it probably tells you more about the integration of new words into the sentences rather than about formation of new memories for words per se. So there is still a need to address memory trace formation more directly. And we know from behavioral studies that suggested that a novel word form creates a lexical entry just by multiple exposures. So this is what we need to address this, and I'll skip the introduction to oddball paradigm that was done quite well by some previous speakers. That the idea is that in the oddball paradigm you have a lexical enhancement for real words. When you control all other variables, you have a lexical enhancement. So physically identical stimuli, when they make up something meaningful, produce an early, like here the red curve, an enhanced response which is bigger than a pseudo word which makes no sense. So this is a reliable effect, about 150 milliseconds, and coming from a different perspective at this, we also know from behavioral tests that even though, like I said, some studies claim a single exposure learning, from more elaborate testing we know that learning can be improved. In this case, in a study by Pittman and colleagues, over the course of approximately 15-minute learning session with 150 trials. So you can see how it sort of plateaus at about 150 trials. So that's what we did. We played our subjects novel word forms or pseudo words 160 times, matched their physical properties, and looked at what happened in this. I'll skip, I think. This is just to show you how well the critics of the stimuli are. And this is what happens. When you look at the very beginning of the learning session, so this is data from just 3 minutes of recording, you see a classical word advantage. You see that the same syllable completing a word produces larger significant response than a pseudo word, this is I think 120 milliseconds in this study. Now, just 10 minutes later, the last 3 minutes of exposure, the difference is not significant anymore. And it's because the pseudo word response has increased, which you can see also in the statistics here. So you can see an insignificant drop in the word responses here in orange, while the pseudo word response, a novel word form response, goes up to the same level as that of a meaningful word. The same shown through regression analysis that looked at smaller portions of responses, looking at every about 10 to 16 trials in succession. You can see a steady increase using linear regression for novel items in their passive exposure over just 14 minutes, and a flat line for the words that the subjects know already. And well, this was also subjected to source analysis, and again, early in the learning session and late in the learning session you can see perisylvian sources for known words, and you don't see them early for novel pseudo words, but they become formed by the end of the 14-minute exposure. So, yes, we can say from this is these sources, they could be our cortical memory traces encoding the novel word form that the subjects have been exposed to. So we can say the brain of the subjects can learn and form new linguistic circuits on the fly, and these are formed in left perisylvian areas immediately in the learning process. And of course, but this study, published last year, was just a single item study, very, very simplistic, so it still had questions unanswered, and the next study extended that finding to a somewhat larger group of words. Here we used a small but well-matched group of bisyllabic words and pseudo words. They were presented not in an oddball paradigm, but just as such, in mixed together with a more natural rate, so faster rate of speech, which was closer to natural human speech. And in addition, to test whether this effect is specific to speech, we put in stimuli that were signal-correlated noise in the same sequences. And because we had more words, the exposure was slightly longer, 20 minutes. And, this is the result. Unfortunately, don't look very nice, but again, the known words produce the same activation early and late in the session. We'll let them go by the end of the session. You will see more clearly an increase for the normal pseudo word from the beginning to the end, or the 20-minute exposure. And here are maps of differences. You don't see for known words are no different because it's also not really different. But for the novel words and the pseudo words, as you go through, there is an increase in the frontal central sensitivity in this case, which is not very well as well. Most of action seems to start at 70 milliseconds and goes on for another 100 milliseconds, peaking about 110, 120. The paradigm was different, and interestingly, the effect was on the positive side of voltage. Similar findings were reported by Diego Balaguer for rule learning in the P200 component. So it's not the same thing. It's not lexical learning that she used, but at least a similar study. Am I done with time? 6, 7 minutes? I'll be done before then probably. So again, another attempt at looking at more fine-grained differences using linear regression and small blocks of trials. And the red line is increase in the pseudo-word activation with time. The blue line, which you can't see, is a flat one for known words. Right, sources for this difference. These are sources of the difference between early and late novel word form exposure. You'll see, this is EEG, of course, a very blurred source localization, but you'll see a frontotemporal constellation of activity, bilateral, but with left hemispheric advantage. And I have to stress at this point that bilateral sources in learning of novel words were also suggested in fMRI studies earlier. Now, our control stimuli, signal-correlated noises, generate a widely different picture, but more importantly, they don't show a difference between, so the top row of maps is the first 2 minutes of perceptual exposure, and then the last. There is no significant difference. If anything, you can see that activity just drops down with time. So it seems like the learning effects we find are specific to phoneme, to lexical learning, to something that's spoken, not just auditory learning per se, even though it might be rooted in auditory function that we share with animals. So we can trace formation of new memory traces for words electrophysiologically as a transient increase in an ERP response. These seem to be formed as networks of neurons in pericilian areas, which I have to note also robust enough to be activated in passive exposure when attention is not on the stimuli. They're formed rapidly on the fly as the brain is exposed to novel lexical material. And to make more general conclusions, I think taken together with fMRI and PET studies and N400 studies I reviewed in the beginning, we have a strong case for a constellation of neocortical areas that take part in online word acquisition. These involve perisylvian structures of the left hemisphere, temporal lobe, inferior frontal gyrus, as well as possibly temporoparietal, premotor and prefrontal regions. Those we know about from fMRI. Depending on the task, method, response that you use in your measurements, the area that you look at, you will find an interplay of activation and deactivation in the rapid learning process. And the dynamics, I think, is still obscure, and we still need to investigate that further. And to confirm the notion of cortical memory trace formation that happens quickly without the long consolidation processes, I was pleased to see a recent paper by Sharon and colleagues in PNAS, who found evidence of fast word learning in patients whose hippocampus was gone. And that was those traces, those words that were learned by these patients were available later. They were tested also in a few days. And importantly, when they found patients who also had temporal lobe damage, left temporal lobe damage, and they did not have that capacity. And as I've said in our data, in other people's data, we seem to see the formation of these traces depends on temporal, on intact left temporal areas. So I think this data can still be accommodated in the general conceptual networks that exist out there. So we can still believe in all the concepts that were there, but I think they need to be modified. They need to take account of something that provides for a faster route, sort of shortcut to word memory trace formation. And I think I'm not going to concentrate on the model. It just shows you how input can go through hippocampus and suggests in addition a shortcut directly from your sensations to neocortical memory traces. So, few questions, of course, and that's not exhaustive, still remain, is whether these traces that are formed rapidly after a longer period. If we did not test our subjects after, say, a few days delay, that would be an interesting thing to do. We haven't tested how they are affected by consolidation. This is something that will be done, hopefully, within the next few months. We haven't tested how this is affected by active attention, so subjects are asked to actively learn, and this is something we're going to do with in Helsinki. I'm very interested in seeing the results. We don't know how meaning, we've only spoken about word form learning in this time. We still don't know how meaning is added to these word forms. And of course, I think one of great questions is how it actually happens not in adult college students, but in children who learn language naturally. And I think with this, I have to thank my collaborators in Cambridge, Helsinki, everywhere, and Berlin. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, let's open up for questions now. Yes, please.
Yeah, I have a question. If these pseudo-words, similar to the national language.
Absolutely. They are made. Yeah.
For example, Chinese or I don't know some African language.
Excellent question. We are looking at it in the next study with Teja.
Okay, more questions, please.
What was the native language of your informant, and whether you were also the words of that language?
The new words were not words of that language, they were pseudo-words of that language, but they were phonotactically legal and similar as much as possible to real words. So they are pronounceable, and they could be words, but they are not. And the studies I showed involved English and Finnish.
And were they exposed to oral speech only?
This is spoken. Yeah, that's one other question that could be put on this list, is what happens with visual word learning.
Yeah, so I think it's more of a computational question. So you demonstrated very rapid learning, right? And my question really is how can you make a system that learns so rapidly to fast noise? So basically you probably after learning taking place in real life as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and but sometimes there might be just errors in the input, right? So how can the system be made robust against that? So whether you accept something as a novel word or as just a speech error.
It's probably statistical.
Yeah.
So we have to have a certain number of exposures. Of the number we don't know, but we are going to look at this as well in a study with Max Garangiani and Matt Davis in Cambridge. But it must be statistical. So once you have a certain number of independent confirmations that this is something meaningful. And I think statistical learning is something that's been shown for children and even newborns.
Okay. Any more questions? Let's go on then. Thank you very much.